From the information I've gathered, the developers of Little Hope, the second installment in the Dark Pictures anthology, drew inspiration from the New England witch trials of the late 17th century. So I figured I'd use this intro to talk about witch trials. And I will, but here's the thing. I was not expecting my research to become as in-depth and as complex as it has. See, I went into this with a very basic understanding of what it was all about. People were stupid and thought witches were real. People killed other people because they thought they were witches. People eventually stopped believing witches were real, but remained stupid in other ways. And while you certainly could sum events up like that, it does so at a great disservice to the reality. There is so much more to all of this than I realized, and it can be connected to things across decades, even centuries. It's like that meme with the dominoes. We could talk about just the one big domino, but that cause for that domino being knocked over is just as important. And the cause for that domino being knocked over is also just as important, and so on and so on. I'm not a historian. I'm just a guy with an internet connection and a link to Wikipedia, but I'm going to try my best here, and hopefully you'll get something out of this. Okay, so first, we gotta start somewhere. We gotta pick a point in time to dig our heels into and say this is the first important point of this whole thing, our first domino, if you will. And for that, I'm going to start off in the early 1500s with the Reformation and the birth of Protestantism. By the 16th century, the Catholic Church had pretty much consumed Europe, turning much of the population into either Catholics or corpses. But a new threat was emerging to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church: Catholics. See, the Church taught people a little too well on how to be good little worshippers, so when some of those people looked at the things the Church was doing, they found what they felt were conflicts with what was intended by God, I guess. Now, generally speaking, things like this were easy enough for the Church to maintain control over. Stirrings of dissent tended to be small and slow to grow, relying on word of mouth or sharing written works created in small supply. But Johann Gutenberg's invention of the movable type printing press would revolutionize the spread of information. Printing was now faster and cheaper, and becoming available to more and more people over time. This meant that more people were getting access to the Bible rather than just the Catholic Church's teaching of the Bible, and more people were asking questions and forming their own ideas about things and challenging the Catholic Church as a result. This also meant that if someone wanted to share those ideas, it was easier to do so and harder to silence it. That's where people like Martin Luther and John Calvin come in, prominent figures in the rise of Protestantism and two of its major denominations. The Protestant movement grows, and demands for reform get louder, and that's the start of the Reformation. Now, over in England, Reformation would take a slight detour. While the Protestant movement was present in England, what really set things off was King Henry VIII wanting a male heir. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, wasn't putting out the right kind of babies, so he asked the Pope to annul his marriage so he could try out another woman's reproductive organs. The Pope said no, so Henry decided that the Catholic Church could just go screw itself. He broke away from the Catholic Church's authority and declared himself the head of the Church of England. He also closed down several monasteries, seized land and property belonging to members of the Catholic Church, and introduced changes to religious practices. But Henry was still very much a Catholic. These were political motivations and not necessarily religious ones, and he just wanted more authority over his own kingdom. However, these changes would pave the way for Protestant Reformation. He was removing a lot of the influence the Catholic Church had in the country, and he was losing the favor of the Catholics in his kingdom, leading him to rely more on the support of Protestants. This resulted in Protestants gaining influence in the direction the Church of England was taking. Now, I could keep going on about Henry VIII and the whole mess that is the House of Tudor, but the short of it is the next few decades and next few rulers of England would see the country shift further into Protestantism, then back to Catholicism, then an attempt at melding the two ideologies together, which leads us to Anglicanism. Compromise is great and all, but you're not going to please everybody no matter what you do, and there's going to be people that are going to want you to do more to make them happy. And when you're trying to ride a middle ground, like with Anglicanism, the pushback often comes from people on the fringe. It also doesn't help that all this religious whiplash meant people were being executed under the name of one religion or another, and then everyone's just expected to get along and conform under this new banner. People get fed up dealing with all your BS. So now we turn our focus to a couple groups of such people, the Puritans and the Brownists. The Puritans were a group of Protestants that pushed for further reform of the Church of England because they still had some big issues with some of the decisions the church was making with its practices. Meanwhile, the Brownists, named after Robert Brown, seemed to have beliefs in line with the Puritans, but they were a group of separatists. They felt the only way they'd be able to live and worship appropriately would be to do so without the oversight and control of the established church. Which you weren't really allowed to do, by the way, so you can imagine how that went for them. The Brownist movement would find its way into the more tolerant Netherlands and build up more strength as publications would bounce back and forth between there and England. Another point for the printing press, everyone. And many Brownists would take refuge in the Netherlands and set up congregations there, and things were sorta okay. While it was a place for them to be free, the Netherlands wasn't exactly a land of great opportunity for many Brownists. They were spending their savings just to get there, ending up with crappy jobs, and were barely getting by as a result. People were giving up and going back to England, which discouraged others who had been planning to make the move themselves. On top of which, the younger members of the community were more easily swayed to non-Puritan ways of life, and tensions were starting to rise again between the Netherlands and Spain. Ultimately, the Brownists decided that if there was any hope of continuing on, they needed to find a new place to call home. Hey, what about this new world that people were talking about? Sailing across the ocean and setting up colonies. You wouldn't think this would have a lot of appeal. A long, treacherous journey to a largely unfamiliar land, potential threats from the native population, extremely harsh living conditions with few supplies to get by on, and the whole thing backed by the same kingdom you're trying to break ties with. But there was one very compelling reason to take that plunge. If they could pull this off, if they could settle and survive and build their community up, they could potentially have the home they always wanted. Hell, the home they felt they needed. And so these pilgrims would hop on a little ship called the Mayflower, set up at Plymouth Rock, engage with the friendly native tribes in the area who helped them to survive, and then they would all celebrate a successful autumn harvest together. And that's why we draw hand turkeys today. Well, actually, what we were taught in kindergarten failed to mention that the Pilgrims came to America in the middle of a harsh winter, half the settlers died of illnesses early on, and there were conflicts with tribes in the area who had past experiences with people coming to their land to kidnap and or murder them. But yeah, things eventually got to the point with the hand turkeys and whatnot, and things were looking up for our little colonists. The alliances they would form with the indigenous tribes helped to establish a fur trade, which meant they'd have a way to pay off their debts and procure additional resources from overseas. And with things becoming more habitable and sustainable, more people from their church could come over and further establish their new home in America. Unfortunately, not everything would remain sunshine and roses, as one Roger Conant would learn when he made his own voyage a few years later, looking for opportunity for himself and his family. People had gotten a little nasty, and not in the good Janet Jackson kind of way. See, the whole point of establishing the Plymouth colony was to have a Brownist paradise, free to create a society how they saw fit, with nobody else up in their business. But as the colony started to thrive, more people were coming over, like Roger Conant, who were not Brownists. They were separatists of other religious denominations looking to escape oppression, or they were opportunists looking to set up shop in this up-and-coming new world. In other words, people were getting up in the Brownist business, and it created tensions. On top of this, the friendly relations with the native tribes had since broken down, and with it, so did the fur trade, resulting in financial struggles. And then one of the major leaders of the Brownist movement passed away in the Netherlands. So the Brownists were left feeling like everything was collapsing around them, and they lashed out, and others in turn lashed out. So things were hostile, and Roger Conant comes in and sees this and decides he doesn't want to deal with all that, and sets out to other budding colonies in the area, settling down in Cape Ann. And from there, he would then lead people to branch further out and establish new communities, including what would become Salem, Massachusetts. Yeah, we can't really talk about colonial witch trials without addressing the most notable of them. But before we dive into all that, let's talk more about witch trials themselves. Concepts like magic and witchcraft and all that fun stuff are seen all throughout history and regarded differently by different cultures, riding the line between religious practice and misunderstood science. Sometimes magic was considered good and awesome and used in efforts to heal or protect others, with practitioners being valued members of their communities. Sometimes magic was considered bad and evil and used in efforts to cause harm, resulting in alleged practitioners being sought out for punishment. So anyway, the Christian stance on witchcraft was, witches aren't real, and such things should be regarded as superstitious nonsense. So as Christianity spread across the world, that messaging spread with it, and people started to chill out a bit, and practices like hunting down witches or trying people for witchcraft started to die down as well. But there were still plenty of people that believed in witches, including many Christians. So things get kinda screwy in how it was all dealt with as time went on. Even though the official stance of Christianity was not to take this stuff all that seriously, and even though there were efforts to deter or outlaw the practices of trying and executing people for witchcraft, it would still happen on occasion. Things got even more screwy because while witchcraft wasn't considered an actual crime, heresy was, and a serious offense at that. In the context of Christianity, heresy would be pretty much anything that appeared to go against Christian doctrine. Pretty broad and ripe for exploitation, right? In fact, going back to all the religious unrest I was talking about in England, both Protestants and Catholics would find themselves regarded as heretics depending on who was in power at the time. So, technically, witchcraft could be classified as heresy. If Christian doctrine says witchcraft isn't real, then someone who believes it is and practices it would be going against Christian doctrine. And yes, by that same line of thinking, someone who believes witchcraft is real and puts someone on trial for it would also be going against Christian doctrine. So if you ever find yourself going back in time to the Middle Ages and getting accused of being a witch, totally throw that in their faces. It'll be hilarious. You'll probably still get thrown in the stocks or burned alive or something, but still. Hilarious. Okay, so yeah. The link between witchcraft and heresy was flimsy at best, but changes to Christian belief would soon strengthen that connection, as people started crafting new lore to explain the nature of witches. In short, they were now determined to be in league with Satan, making pacts with the devil to obtain their powers, then grooming children to recruit them into their ranks, and doing nefarious things like eating babies and having orgies. This all sounds sadly familiar. Boy, we really haven't come very far in the last few hundred years, huh? But yeah, so now it was considered much more worthwhile for Christianity to acknowledge and combat the threat of witches. Then you have a Catholic inquisitor over in Germany named Heinrich Kramer, who was weirdly obsessed with witches, women, and sex. His attempts to prosecute women for witchcraft were considered without merit, and he was dismissed as being a nutjob. Kramer wouldn't stand for this and decided he needed to get his message out there to others that would listen to his insanity, and then by developing a following, he'd force his way into being taken seriously. Since podcasts didn't exist back then, he did the next best thing, wrote a book. The Malleus Maleficarum was a sort of handbook detailing the evils of witchcraft and the best ways to torture and murder suspected witches. Kramer's obsessions also laid the foundation for associating witchcraft more so with women than with men. The book ended up being quite successful and influential, with copies of it spreading all across Europe. A point against the printing press, everyone. So this, combined with the revised Christian theology, kinda whipped people back up into a panic over witches, and the decades that followed would see thousands upon thousands of women, children, and men subjected to torture and put to death. For various reasons, the witch panic revival would start to die out in Europe just in time for things to pick up in New England. But it wasn't the Salem witch trials that kicked everything off. Instead, it is believed that Connecticut holds that claim to fame. The earliest documentation of a suspected witch being executed in New England is from 1647, with Alce Young being hanged in Hartford. Following that, the era of the Connecticut witch trials would continue on for another 23 years. So why is it that all anyone ever talks about is Salem? Why did I, someone who has lived in Connecticut their whole life and is very smart and handsome, not really know this was even a thing until making this video? Well, there's a few reasons. I'd say that the events in Connecticut were kinda your run-of-the-mill typical fear of witches that we'd already been seeing in Europe. It wasn't particularly unique or remarkable. What makes the trials in Massachusetts stand out then is just how much insanity was packed into such a brief period of time and what allowed things to get to that point in the first place. It's like there was something in the water in Massachusetts or something. Well, tea. But that was much later. As I said, the era of witch trials in Connecticut spanned a couple decades and resulted in a few dozen cases and 11 executions. But over in Massachusetts, from February of 1692 to May of 1693, there were over 200 accusations, 19 executions, a few people who would die in prison, and one person that was tortured to death for refusing to enter a plea. Connecticut was a slow, controlled burn, and Salem was a wildfire. Now, when I say controlled, I mean that Connecticut had a voice of reason that worked to maintain peace as best they could. John Winthrop Jr. was a well-respected man who served as magistrate in Connecticut before becoming governor and being re-elected all the way up until his death in 1676. A firm believer in science and firm disbeliever in witchcraft, he used his position and reputation to try and lead people toward more civil and tolerant behavior. And in the instances where accusations of witchcraft were thrown about, he'd work hard to protect the accused from harm. No convicted witch was executed under the oversight of Winthrop as governor. Unfortunately, there was a window of roughly 1 year where Winthrop traveled back to England. During this window, 4 people would be convicted and hanged. Upon his return to Connecticut, he established changes to court practices that not only helped to further protect accused witches, but to reduce those accusations in the first place. For Massachusetts, there's way too much to talk about, but the short of it is the colony remained very heavily controlled by Puritan influence since its formation. Strict adherence to religious belief, and strict intolerance and disdain for those who believed something different. As a result, there was a lot of tension in the colony, and instead of voices of reason, they just had voices reaffirming the idea that Satan and his minions were literally among us. Just like that game with the space people. Doom. And really, just look at Salem, Massachusetts today. They want you to know about this stuff. They keep us talking about this stuff. They've embraced their history and marketed the town as a tourist destination for all things witchy, especially around Halloween. So yeah, Salem is the thing to talk about when it comes to witch trials in New England, and we've laid out a lot of the background and a lot of the dominoes to explain how things were building up how they did. So it's time to knock it all down and deal with the mess it creates. Now, the Salem witch trials can refer to 2 things. Most of the actual trials for the accused in Massachusetts took place in Salem town, but the ground zero for the hysteria started in Salem Village, which is known as Danvers today. Here, 2 girls would start behaving oddly, having convulsions and complaining about pains with unknown causes. Betty Paris and Abigail Williams were the daughter and niece of the current minister of Salem Village, Samuel Paris. Paris was a polarizing figure in the village, considered strict and old-fashioned even by Puritan standards. His church alienated many people and created a bit of an exclusive circle. He was also one of those voices mentioned earlier that preached heavily about an actual Satan running around and creating fear and distrust amongst the people. So now 2 of his relatives were suffering from what he would determine to be the work of the devil. When more girls in the village also started experiencing similar symptoms, that clearly meant these girls were being tormented with evil magic. And now the finger-pointing begins. The Afflicted Girls, as they came to be known, first accused Tituba, a South American native, and Paris's slave. Soon after, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were implicated as well. Sarah Good was a destitute woman who relied on charity to get by and was considered by others to be a very unpleasant person. Sarah Osborne had drawn the disapproval of many other members of the community for defying her late husband's will, claiming ownership of the property that was to be given to their sons. And she also had sex with her next husband before they were actually married. Ooh. So the idea here is that living a good Christian life was impossible for a witch to do, on account of being in league with Satan and all. So those that didn't conform were probably witches. But the other idea here is that accusations of witchcraft could be an extremely powerful weapon. If people believe in witches, and people trust you, you can convince them that someone is a witch. Someone that maybe you don't like for one reason or another, like, say, a homeless woman with a bad reputation among the community, or a woman creating a dispute over her late husband's will, which put her at odds with a very prominent family in the village and in the church. You see what I'm getting at here? It really can't be proved, but it can be heavily speculated upon that many of the accusations were the result of Samuel Parris and the Putnam family pulling the strings in an attempt to eliminate enemies and maintain their influence and status. Some people, like Sarah Good, could be seen as easy targets to sacrifice in order to build the credibility of the witch threat, while also cleaning up the village of undesirables. Others, like Sarah Osborne, were in conflict with people like the Putnams in some form or another, and branding them as a witch was an easy way for the Putnams to come out on top of these conflicts. And then there's Tituba. Samuel Parris beat a confession out of his slave, forcing her to not only admit to being a witch, but to also verify that Good and Osborne were witches as well. And that's another big thing about how these trials would go. If you were accused, you knew what awaited you if you were found guilty, and you also knew it was very likely you would be found guilty. But maybe if you confessed and sought forgiveness, maybe if you named other witches, you might come out of this alive. Tituba ended up becoming something of an expert witness. Being an indigenous woman, aka godless savage, it was generally accepted that she was familiar with the occult, and the information she would provide about magical practices and other witches in the colony was considered credible and valuable. It also caused a great deal of chaos. With her confession and her testimony, it strengthened the beliefs and fears that witches were real, and they were here. Combine this with the Afflicted Girls, who were growing in number. They were considered experts in their own way. By being the targets of witchcraft, they claimed they could see things that others could not, like witches' familiars, or the shadowy figure of the devil looming over the accused. They'd even go into fits during the examinations, claiming they were being magically attacked right in front of everyone. And this was all considered as actual evidence. How nuts is that? In a trial where a person's life is hanging in the balance, their fate could be decided by a child saying that a ghost pinched them. It's absolutely insane. And there were people in the community who saw the insanity for what it was. People like Martha Corey, who ended up being a bit too outspoken in her disapproval and even outright accused the girls of making everything up. As a result, she would find herself being accused of witchcraft. Rebecca Nurse was another of the accused, likely another case of a Putnam-related conflict, and when her 2 sisters spoke out in protest of the whole affair, they also became targets. Accusations like these caused quite a stir. Unlike Tituba, Sarah Good, or Sarah Osborne, these people were well regarded in the community. they were not the usual suspects when it came to witches. And while this did cause some folks to stand up and try and defend the accused and try to put all this witch nonsense to rest, it wasn't enough. The idea that those you'd least suspect of being witches turning out to be witches just escalated the fear and paranoia to new heights. More and more accusations were being made, and the frenzy started to spread to other communities in the colony. To me, this is where events really take on a life of their own. The hysteria is no longer in the hands of Samuel Parris or the Putnam family, or being spurred on by the act of the Afflicted Girls. It's not even contained within Salem Village anymore. It's now completely out of control. Everyone's pointing fingers at everyone and nobody's safe. Even George Burrows, a former minister of Salem Village, is arrested. Even the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good is questioned. Even some of the Afflicted Girls turn on each other. Even Samuel Parris and the Putnam family, once untouchable, now face the risk of being formally accused. Meanwhile, the jails are filling up with people awaiting trial. That's right, we haven't even gotten to the trial part of the Salem witch trials. The problem was that the Massachusetts Bay colony was transitioning into the province of Massachusetts Bay by way of royal charter. So during this period, there was no properly established higher level of government, which meant no court to actually conduct the trials, which meant people were rotting away in prison for weeks, even months, before they would actually be tried for their crimes. Could you imagine that happening today in America? Oh, you can? Yeah. But eventually, William Phips would return from England with the charter and be sworn in as governor. Soon after, a court was established to address the massive backlog of potential witches and other criminals, and this is where the killing starts. Guilty verdicts were handed out and people were sentenced to hang by the handful. And if you think being confronted with the deadly consequences of their behavior might have sobered people up and made them realize how messed up everything was, you'd be kinda right, actually. You're dehumanizing these people when you regard them as witches, as servants of the devil. That was by design, and it worked pretty well, but a hefty dose of reality can overcome that really quickly. Or at least having your own BS come back to bite you in the ass. As mentioned, George Burrows was arrested as a suspected witch. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. As people gathered to watch him and others be hanged, Burrows began to recite the Lord's Prayer, something that was regarded as impossible for a witch to do. Imagine you were absolutely convinced someone was a vampire, and then you see them splashing around in a river in broad daylight and eating some garlic bread in the shape of a cross, and someone was about to kill them for being a vampire. That's basically what was happening here, and you can imagine that really shook some people up. Unfortunately, Burrows would still be hanged moments later, along with 4 others. And then there's Giles Corey, husband of Martha Corey mentioned earlier. He was also accused and arrested not long after she was, but he refused to plead. At the time, you couldn't put someone on trial without them first doing so, which meant you'd need to convince a person to cooperate, which meant torture. Giles Corey was laid out on the ground and his body covered with a large wooden board. Large, heavy rocks were then placed upon the board, and he was expected to submit and enter a plea when it became too unbearable to withstand any longer. Instead, Giles refused, and each time he was asked how he'd plead, he simply responded, "More weight." On the 3rd day of his torture, Giles Corey would die, crushed under rocks, having never entered a plea. With his torture being a public display, the people of the village were not shielded from the horrors of Giles's cruel treatment, and doubts continued to grow regarding all this witch nonsense. But despite this, things were still very much in motion to continue as they had. More accusations, more arrests, more trials, and more executions, with no end in sight. Governor William Phips had mostly remained uninvolved in the trials, his attention being directed towards conflict in Maine. but he'd return home at the end of September and see the state of things. By this point, even his own wife was apparently being eyed as a possible witch, so he stepped in, and over the course of October, he would prohibit any further arrests from being made, prevent the use of spectral evidence from being used in trials, i.e., a ghost is pinching me, release many accused from prison, and would ultimately dissolve the special court and form a new one with stricter scrutiny over the remaining trials. While there were still some guilty verdicts to be handed down, Phipps intervened to prevent more executions until the final trials were completed in the middle of May. Can you imagine how awkward things must have been when all the chaos finally died down? Anyway, moving into the 18th century, witch trials as we know them would continue to die out as people stopped being stupid and believing witches were real but remained stupid in other ways. Still, there are many cultures around the world where beliefs in witches and witchcraft still persist today. And sadly, there are still places where people are beaten, tortured, and killed because they are suspected of being witches. And on that happy note, let's play a video game, shall we?
Games, please.